Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you might be in this virtual world. Welcome to our conversation about privacy requirements for CBDCs. My name is Jens from Currency Research. Before I introduce our guest for today, just a few ground rules for this. We want this to be interactive, so please use the commentary function on your screen, put in your questions, put in your commentary, and I'll keep an eye out for that and try to weave that into the conversation as we go along. But without further ado, let me welcome our guest for today, Jennifer Lessiter from the Digital Dollar Project. And there she is.
Hi, Jens.
Hello, Jen.
Hello.
Jen, maybe before we start our chat, if you want to introduce yourself quickly and talk a little bit about the Digital Dollar Project and what that's all about.
Sure, I would love to. Thank you so much for hosting and inviting me to join this important conversation today. I'm really excited and very excited that it's an interactive session. So just to underscore, if there are questions and comments, please add them. Privacy is far from being solved in the digital currency space, and it's very helpful and exciting to see folks' opinions on this. Thank you also to the Currency Research staff for supporting the productions today. So just a moment to introduce myself. As Jens mentioned, I'm Executive Director for the Digital Dollar Project. For those of you who are not familiar with Digital Dollar Project, we are a nonprofit based outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States, and we're focused on catalyzing discussion and experimentation with the private sector around United States central bank digital currency. So in plain English, you can think of us as a general think tank with an experimentation arm. We have a pilot program that we'll talk a little bit more about today and how we're testing and experimenting with privacy that tries to replicate hypotheses and results in real life use cases and applications for central bank digital currency. Just a couple of things to note. In 2020, when we first started, we published a white paper outlining the business case for US central bank digital currency experimentation, and we proposed a champion model for the US central bank digital currency. I'm not going to review the champion model right now because I want to keep us hyper-focused on privacy, but I do want to call out that 2 of the 8 characteristics are privacy and technical decisions and design choices driven by functional needs, both of which are pretty relevant for today's discussion. Last year, just a couple things to touch on, and if anyone is interested in getting involved as we're going through this conversation, please feel free to visit our website to get more information. But last year, we announced, as I said, an initial pilot program. We completed our first central bank digital currency private sector initiated pilot with the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. We established the Open Digital Currency Initiative alongside partners from Linux Foundation, Hyperledger, and Finos. We launched a technical sandbox program, which is a technology neutral environment for private sector organizations to explore potential technical designs for digital currency. And we worked to provide public policy thought leadership, hold public discussions and events, and act as subject matter experts in various working groups. Last year was a really busy year in the United States for central bank digital currency, with the president's executive order in March and the Federal Reserve Board's discussion paper in February. And then finally, Jens, I will say, just to close this introduction, this year has been incredibly busy for Digital Dollar Project already. 2 things I want to call out are 2 cornerstone events that we are planning for. The first is a series of privacy roundtables where we will discuss technical optionality, definitions for privacy, use cases, and really reimagine how we're thinking about different policy frameworks to support privacy and central bank digital currencies. And then in the fall, we'll be hosting a global convening in the United States where we will convene central banks and private sector actors together to talk about that very small intersection between interoperability and global standard setting. We look to the work that we're doing on privacy in the first half of this year to be a very foundational component for that conversation. So thank you for letting me introduce the organization. I think it's important so folks understand my lens as we're approaching this discussion today is really one from a place of research and experimentation.
Lovely, great. No, thank you for that introduction. Also, thanks for giving a bit of an outlook of what this year is going to look like from your perspective and what you're going to be busy with. I know we're also planning to do some joint work in Mexico City at our digital currency conference in May. So we're looking forward to do that with you. But maybe for today, focusing on the privacy topic, maybe just starting with a question: what actually is privacy when we're talking about privacy? What do we mean? Because I think some people have different perceptions on what privacy actually is. Is it anonymity or is it privacy? What's the difference between the two? What's your take on that?
I think it's a very big question, and it's what we're setting out to explore through our roundtables this year. I think we also do a really good job of not speaking in plain English when we start to talk about the intersection of privacy, policy, and technology. So with that in mind, as I was thinking about how to structure a response to that question today, I really started to think what are the components I think of that define privacy? And I came down to, as you mentioned, anonymity, privacy, of course, and security. I think they're intricately related and it's hard to define one without defining all three. So in very plain English, I would start and say anonymity, right, is keeping identity private, but not activities. Privacy, keeping something to yourself, and that self could be an individual or an organization, and this could include activities. And then security, the measures taken to keep something safe. And it's important to note here that the definition of safe itself is variable and use case specific. So why are defining those three words together important to me? If we view each, anonymity, privacy, and security, on a sliding scale, and we assume none are an absolute state, but rather constantly competing for prioritization, then we start to see where tensions arise. So, plain English, prioritizing complete anonymity compromises a system's ability to be completely secure. A practical example of that would be something that we've all done before, which would be enabling, right, an authentication log. When I do this on my computer, it takes away my ability to sign in anonymously, but enhances the system's ability to detect fraudulent logins. In addition, there is an added complexity that we see in that example. And that is the definition or need for privacy, anonymity, and security is role-centric. So what an individual user wants or defines as privacy can be different and at odds with what the system provider, the financial institution, or perhaps the government wants. And here is where we also start to see nuanced policy discussions around defining needs versus wants. So that is a very textbook approach to the definition of privacy. If I can, I'd love to take it one step further, which is to talk about really the complexities or optionalities that are in front of us with digital assets. So in Digital Dollar Project's privacy principle papers, which again, everyone can find on our website, this was published almost 2 years ago now, we talk about a couple of different factors, right? We talk about the historic role of central banks in fiat currency, the disruption that recent decades have brought in the form of trade and financial flows becoming globalized. This includes connection to the internet, modern technologies, of course. And we talk about new forms of currency that have emerged that are available 24/7 and are digitally native. And there is a portion of the paper that takes a very surface look at legal standards and their application in this digitizing world. I say surface look because that within itself is very worthy of a year's worth of research and discussion. But through this lens, we see two things. One, money confirmed as a social construct. This means it's a concept that exists both in objective reality and as a result of human interaction and trust. Very important. And two, we see that a digitally native currency that knits together the right properties could become the functional currency for any given country, any geographic region, any political, social, or commercial environment. So when folks ask why privacy is so important, I point to this and say, if central bank digital currencies are ill-designed for consumer and institutional preferences, so again, harking back to driving towards functional needs when we think of our design choices, then that digital currency will cede ground, or that fiat currency will cede ground in this new competitive digital field. So one data point, just to direct folks, the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center released a couple of years ago a central bank digital currency tracker. I was just reminiscing yesterday, I can't believe it's been 2 years. It's a wonderfully deep resource to understand what activity is happening in terms of development and deployment and policy in which countries. At the end of last year, they also introduced a cryptocurrency tracker, mirroring the principles that they were researching and reflecting through the CBDC tracker. An interesting point of note is that regardless of whether they were researching CBDCs or cryptocurrencies, and regardless of the maturity of that work in countries, privacy was the #1 factor of concern. So that tells me, again, going back to if a CBDC is ill-designed, it will fail, that we need to prioritize privacy, and we need to understand on that sliding scale when and where we prioritize anonymity, privacy, and security.
Yes. No, that makes perfect
that
sense.
That was a lot. Thank you. It's a lot to work through, and I'll just say that even those definitions within themselves are worth a debate.
Yes. No, I agree, and I think that's the complexity that a lot of people are still trying to get to grips with, because it's not as self-explanatory as a lot of people think, and I think there's also a trend towards polarization, that it's always, well, we need complete privacy or we need complete transparency, and really finding that middle ground where all of the risks are being managed in the right way. That's the challenge here. But we got a question from the audience actually that fits in quite well at this point. To the extent that you comment, it's from Jordan, thank you. To the extent that you comment, are there approaches to privacy that any international CBDC projects are considering that you find particularly attractive? So are there any projects out there where you say that they are on at least on to some good practices?
Yeah, so I get a similarly structured question a lot, which is which country is getting it right? It's a complicated answer because each country is going to design for the culture or the principles that they want to see represented locally. There are some choices that are out there now. We've seen activity, of course, in the technical design of the EUN in China. And there I would challenge folks to look at technical design in comparison to policy or regulatory framework, and how the EUN is constructed technically versus how data can be accessed by the government and other institutional actors. Really reflects, I think, the cultural norms of their society and what they're trying to achieve. We see the ECB taking a lens that incorporates GDPR and MiCA, certain forms of both of those forms of regulation, and who owns the data and holds the data and how it's accessed. I would say for the United States, we have not weighed in on privacy in a meaningful way from our government yet. And this is why Digital Dollar Project is pulling together the Roundtable series in the United States and the convening in November in the United States, because we truly believe that the democratic principles that US citizens hold to be true as a bar for others to meet as they are developing their central bank digital currencies. If we can I have one slide, I'm hoping that it's conducive to this format for chatting. If we could pull that slide up. In the Digital Dollar Project's privacy principle paper that was published 2 years ago, we set out a few principles for a US central bank digital currency. We said it needed to be private, meaning that people should be able to use central bank digital currency without making themselves subject to undue corporate tracking or government surveillance. It should be secure, meaning it should not improve or degrade people's security, right, against theft, illegal seizure, hacking, fraud. It should be accessible, so it should improve Americans and global dollars use to access to financial services, and it should be transparent. So the system on which the CBDC runs itself should be operationally transparent so that a variety of parties, this is government, NGOs, right, business, academics, can independently assure themselves about its technical functioning. Building off of those principles, we went kind of in the direction that Jordan was going with this question, which is if every country is potentially prioritizing in a different way, and we look at those three privacy definitions, right? Anonymity, privacy, and security. If we know they're on a sliding scale, how could we start to create a rubric that doesn't say this is the right way to do it, but says, as you are determining which components you wish to prioritize, then how can you validate or have access to some sort of framework that helps you understand where privacy sits in that prioritization, dependent on which technical choices you take. So for our privacy roundtables, we created this set of privacy requirements. They're very much in draft. We introduced them to a group of folks yesterday and got a ton of feedback. Lots of holes poked, lots of spicy conversation, as it should be. But it's a starting point for us to think about what are some requirements that we could look at from a technical perspective, and then following a policy perspective for a digital dollar. So enhancing the four principles I talked about earlier, we leaned in on private by default, right? So we know that we can add different layers of anonymity or privacy or security into the layers of the digital dollar itself. How do we use privacy enhancing technologies to be able to do that? And what functionality, which level are we driving towards? Cash-like characteristics for the digital economy. This is really important. For Digital Dollar Project, we don't see central bank digital currencies replacing cash. So at a minimum, it needs to provide the same standards of privacy, safety, and censorship-resistant transactions as cash does today. We actually think if we can explore the privacy enhancing technologies a bit more, we might be able to create an even more private medium for folks. Improving the account-based financial privacy status quo. So again, I think starting from where we are today and in plain English, being able to describe how privacy manifests in our financial system today. What does it mean to collect data, to store data, and to share data if you are an individual, a financial institution, a regulator, for example? And improving upon that account-based status and experience. And again, we hypothesize that we can make it stronger. Protected against all forms of financial surveillance. For clarity, this does not mean we completely get rid of AML, KYC measures. It means that we look at how we can achieve certain desires to recognize fraudulent activity, to identify bad actors. How do we do that in a digital state using the technologies to our advantage? It might look different, and we might want it to look different in this completely new ecosystem. Accessible and inclusive design and policy choices. Again, thinking about people who are outside of the traditional financial system today. It's not how do we get them in, how do we get them a bank account? It's what is their relationship with money, and how do they operate outside of a traditional finance system? And is there a way for us in designing this new financial system to be able to prioritize their needs or their relationships with money? And then security by design, which is pretty self-explanatory. So we're using these requirements as a starting point with a very diverse group of stakeholders. This is the second audience to put these in front of. They'll be shared broadly on our website. probably in the next month or two. And we're excited to be able to start the conversation. If something isn't matching, if there are assumptions that are being made that we aren't calling out, use cases, right? Because again, so many people that would be touched and impacted in the use of a central bank digital currency. Really big table approach to how do we think about these requirements, and can we create a rubric that, again, just to come back to Jordan's question, doesn't say this is who's doing it right, but takes into account and gives people a framework to be able to measure how privacy is manifesting in these individual CBDCs.
Okay, great, thank you. And
yeah.
There's so much to unpack here. We could spend the next 3 hours. Or that's why you're having these roundtables, of course. But let me just pick up on one aspect here, and that is,
and I'm still please, I was going to say we can bring the slide down, Jens, unless you want to leave it up. Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you.
So I'm still trying to wrap my own head around that. There's a lot of concern in the industry that a CBDC could become too successful and cause disintermediation of the commercial sector, right? And also one school of thinking, at least, that is saying that if we have complete privacy, that would actually then make it so hard to stop this intermediation, because if you want to introduce a cap on your holding of CBDC, for instance, how would you actually do that if there's complete privacy? How would you actually enforce then some of these limitations to protect the commercial sector? Have you guys already drilled deep into that, or is that one for the future now to resolve during these roundtable discussions?
Yeah, no, that's actually very much part of the conversation right now. And I think just to pick on diverse set of stakeholders, right? What does that mean? We've seen a lot of experimentation happening globally, a lot of it managed by the Bank of International Settlements, or International Settlements. What those experiments do, though, is they prioritize the operations and the needs of the central bank in that experimentation. We all know, right, if we go back to some of the points I called out earlier about money being very much a social construct, there are a lot of other players in the full life cycle of a transaction, right? And again, we're just talking very specifically about financial transactions. We must include the perspectives of our commercial institutions, right? One of the tenets in our champion model, and one that was echoed from the Federal Reserve Board in their discussion paper last year, is that we will maintain a two-tiered system. And I do think there's a couple of different camps here, right? There's the pragmatic camp that says systemic or societal change is going to take a long time. We're not going to wake up next year. I'm not going to be able to go and use US central bank digital currency to buy my coffee, right? We have a long road ahead of us, and our hope at Digital Dollar Project is that road includes a lot of those types of discussions with those commercial institutions that in the foreseeable future are very large players and distributors of money. And this then is where we start to pick up on how do different digital currencies enhance or could enhance each other. So in terms of setting limits, or being concerned that CBDCs would get rid of commercial money, right? I actually would also argue and would want to test both hypotheses. The alternate hypothesis being, do we see more money in the system because central bank money, fiat currency, is digital and accessible, and you don't have to go to a brick and mortar, right, to get it. And we see then innovations and competition with the stablecoin industry and bank stablecoins or tokenized bank deposits. And what does that allow to flourish, and products, right, to be developed and to support end users, whether it's an organization or an individual. Then finally, I will say it's not just the institutions, the commercial institutions, that are important. It is also our NGOs that are providing a lot of relief directly to citizens in respective countries. It is the citizens themselves who have to believe and trust in the money, whether it's digital or paper. And again, going back to that example of how are we looking at people's relationship with money and how has it changed? Again, a lot of great research that's happened outside of the United States. MIT's Digital Currency Initiative just released some research on financial inclusion and central bank digital currencies. But that research was not done in the US. There's a lot to understand and unpack about what inclusion in a future system might look like. And again, prioritizing the perspective of the each of the roles along that process as we're thinking holistically about the design. So I hope that answers your question. I think it's big table, lots of stakeholders understand in a hypothesis which role you're prioritizing, which principles you're testing, and then really building collectively to potentially develop a central bank digital currency that enhances what we already have in our system today.
All right. I'm just conscious of time. I can't believe that we've already been here for 25 minutes. We do want to wrap up on half an hour. So maybe as a last topic and last question, you were mentioning already the risk of AML, KYC, et cetera, and how a digital currency needs to be designed to deal with that. And again, if you take Bitcoin as one example, I think Bitcoin actually has very little privacy, right? It's all there, it's in the open, it's on the blockchain, but there's no real KYC happening at the front. So there's still all of these undisclosed individuals that are holding Bitcoin, and you don't know who's behind that. So what kind of design principles do we need for digital currencies that help with anti-terrorism financing, with AML, and so on and so on? How do we best design a currency so we don't fall into that trap of enabling crime?
So I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I do think having your law enforcement agencies or and parties that are responsible or connected to the execution of providing data or collecting data that could be accessed through legal means by your law enforcement at the table with your technologists, at the table with your policymakers, all representing their individual concerns and desires is very important. I think one of the things that Digital Dollar Project works very diligently to do is to break down silos in that development process. We do not want our central bank developing a system and not collecting feedback from the public. We saw several opportunities for public engagement through public comment last year, which we were very excited about. We also recognize that particularly when it comes to privacy enhancing technologies, the private sector is where a lot of that knowledge and innovation is happening. So how do we allow for knowledge share? How are we using open source development in certain instances to make sure that our policymakers are making data-driven decisions that are fed by these experts in the field? So again, I think the broader the approach, which also means probably the slower the process of getting to whether or not we even develop or deploy a central bank digital currency in the US is very important. And I would sacrifice speed to make sure that we are including all of those perspectives and actually enhancing the system versus feeling perhaps only geopolitical pressure, right, to deploy in the US. And I'll just make a note there, which is to say, while we are going through that process as a country, there is still room for the United States and others to participate at the global standard setting level. That does not commit you to deployment of a central bank digital currency. So bringing the weight of the US and privacy as we see them manifesting through our democratic principles into a standard setting conversation that says, countries will develop what they're going to develop for CBDCs. We want to make sure they talk to each other, but what does that mean across jurisdiction? Here are our privacy standards that will need to be met. This helps both ensure trust in the system from an institutional perspective as well as an individual perspective. So I will, again, tell folks, we are a nonprofit. We welcome all perspectives at the table in this discussion. If you are interested, digitaldollarproject.org, or send an email to info@digitaldollarproject.org. This is a brief conversation. There's so much more, and that rigorous debate only happens if you participate in it. So please join us.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much for that. Time's up. Thanks very much for being here today for this conversation. I look forward to continuing the discussion, partly at the roundtables and then going forward, as I said, looking forward actually to see you in Mexico City as well for our digital currency conference. Wonderful. And there's a lot of work to do. That's for sure.
Yes.
Thank you again very much. All the best.
Thank you, Jens.